Hi everyone, welcome to Unit 3, where we're going to talk about direct and indirect data collection methods as they relate to the functional behavior assessment process. So the objectives this week are really two major ones. The first is how do we define environmental variables in observable and measurable terms? And then the second is how do we design and implement individualized behavior assessment procedures that are essentially used to determine the function of a problem behavior. So the terms this week are all listed above here. They're also defined in your Unit 3 folder. I want to emphasize that although you've already learned the definition of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement and reversal design and multi-element alternating treatment design if you've taken APC 628, what I want to emphasize here is that these words, these terms are used in a different aspect. They are all about the functional behavior assessment process and what that means to truly identify the function behind a challenging behavior so that we can change it so they can have more socially significant outcomes. So just to review what we talked about last week, there's 4 steps to conducting a functional behavior assessment. The first is identifying those challenging behaviors in concrete and observable terms. I'll revisit this briefly in a few moments. Second, of course, is to measure those challenging behaviors to establish that baseline data and perform assessments. That I'm going to talk about a lot more this week, direct and indirect measurements. Third is we need to evaluate that data. We need to look at that data so that we can develop a hypothesis that really describes why we think the problem behavior is occurring. Knowing that, as Cooper talks about, the functional behavior assessment hypothesis is always static, it's changing. What we think may be may not always be. So we need to be sure that we're being vigilant about our data collection strategies, methods. So also to emphasize, once we do that work, when we develop a behavior intervention plan, I'm going to continue to remind everyone of this as we move through this process. There are 3 major things we need to make sure we do. The first is we need to make the problem behavior irrelevant, so it's no longer meaningful. Second is inefficient, so we can provide that replacement behavior. Although we want the desired behavior, the reality is that's not always happening, so a replacement behavior is used instead. And then ineffective. We want to minimize the likelihood of any reinforcement when that problem behavior reoccurs. These are the 3 main components that are needed to truly change behavior through a behavior intervention plan. Now, the reason why I want to emphasize this before we get into data collection procedures is we are not allowed, or I shouldn't say allowed, we're not able to effectively make a problem behavior irrelevant, inefficient, and ineffective unless we get the right data we need to identify why the why the problem behavior is recurring, how we can make it no longer meaningful, how we can create a replacement behavior, and how we can minimize the likelihood of any reinforcement. So we need to know all of the strategies and things we can use for prevention in order to truly be able to change that problem behavior. And all of that comes from Horner's 2006 work. So reminder, step 1, when we do an operational definition, we want to remind ourselves, can a dead man do it? Remember, if it's not stated in observable and measurable terms, then a dead man can do it. So for example, we want very descriptive behavior like kicking his feet against the chair, throwing books, biting his own fingers, hitting his head with his fist. What we don't want are some more mentalistic terms like having a tough time, being frustrated, being irritable, those types of things. And my face is hidden so I can still show you some of these charts. How do we identify those challenging behaviors in concrete and observable terms? This should be a reminder from last week, but I just want to point out we've got general descriptors, and then here's where we can have those in observable and concrete terms. So, for example, if a student is aggressive, we might say during lunch when a student is not provided with what he wants, he hits other children with his fists. So emphasis on he hits other children with his fists. This definition also actually provides some context as to what the triggers are for this behavior. We also have an example of student is disruptive, and that would be defined as student continuously calls out and makes loud noises during math seat work. Again, it's concrete and it's observable. Finally, student is hyperactive. If we just said a student is hyperactive, we're all going to interpret that according to what we might culturally view hyperactive behavior. Instead, let's make it concrete and observable by saying the student continuously moves around on their seat, plays with items on desk, and gets out of his seat without permission during reading activities. Much more concrete. Okay, so now let's talk about step 2, what this unit really is all about, which is data. Collecting our data, because data essentially will do all of the talking with the functional behavior assessment process. So, what you want to find out when we collect our data are things like where are the behaviors most and least likely to occur. A lot of times when people collect data, they collect data on where the behavior is happening. And in fact, a lot of times individuals will come to me, students will come to me, teachers will come to me, and they'll say, okay, well, I'm taking data on this behavior, and the problem is he's not doing it at all. So should I start over? Should I find another student? And I say, no, no, no. Definitely keep taking data. You want to find out, maybe through an indirect measurement, like an interview with either a teacher or a parent or somebody else, or through some permanent product forms, which we'll talk about more in detail in a minute. But at the same time, you also want to take data on when the behavior is least likely to occur, because that can tell you the kind of environment that fosters positive behavior in that individual. For example, you might find that a student is more likely to exhibit a behavior during unstructured times like recess and playground and in the cafeteria. And then you might find it's least likely to occur during structured activities like small group reading or math instruction with the teacher. That tells you something. That tells you the type of environment you might want to emulate when you create your behavior intervention plan. So, things you might want to look at. If you're looking at a student in the school site, auditorium, bus stop. By the way, I've ridden a lot of school buses, and I can tell you we can learn a lot about student behavior by riding on the bus. I hate to say it, but if you know that there's a child or a student who's having behavior challenges and you know it's particularly on the bus, you're going to need to ride the bus to see what's truly happening. Cafeteria, classroom, for example, reading, writing, math. You want to look at all the different subjects and all the different areas. You want to look at other settings like maybe the computer room, maybe the hallway, bathroom, library, special classrooms, walkways, etc. Other ones, subjects that are being taught, you might want to pay attention to this particular subjects. Find out if maybe a student has more difficulty with one subject versus another. Time of day, look at things like before the school day, morning, afternoon, late afternoon, or instructional activities or lack of. Looking at specific individual assignments. Does it happen more or less during group activities, during small groups, during read aloud? What about non-academic activities? Do you see it more during changing classes like transitions, playground, lunch, etc.? So just to go back to that, I want to emphasize that this week, this unit is about data collection, but it's a lot more than how you measure it. It's about where you measure it. It's about what you look at. It's about how you can find those patterns to really identify what the function of the problem behavior is. Okay, keeping forward with this. There's also things that we refer to as situations or setting events. These are different things that we refer to as slow triggers. They set us up to potentially have a bad day. If you're CPI trained, they refer to that as precipitating factors, but essentially they're things that can make our lives more difficult. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have a bad day, but it could set us up to have a bad day. For example, if I were to wake up late, my alarm goes off late, I'm behind getting ready, I get to work and I'm at a meeting and all of a sudden someone asks me to submit a report I was supposed to submit. I might get triggered off. I might get upset. Not necessarily because of what was asked of me, but because I kind of already had a bad day. So some situations or setting events that can occur are things like arguing with parents before school, fighting with a peer, especially maybe on the school bus or in the playground or in the hallway, or if you're in middle school or high school, there's lots of drama that's always going on, maybe getting a text that hurt your feelings or something was posted on Instagram that hurt your feelings or whatever. Social media makes it really easy for people to have their feelings hurt. Getting in trouble previously, so maybe they got in trouble the class period before, or it might even be dislikes or having a difficult time with the assignment or required activity, kind of already having a bad relationship with math, being teased, harassed, or intimidated by a peer, fatigue or illness, test anxiety, social conflicts, This is just a few examples of the many different types of situations or setting events that could potentially be a slow trigger for a student's problem behavior. Okay, so moving on. We also want to look at reported consequences versus observable consequences. And I'm going to talk a lot more about the ABC analysis, ABC recording in a little bit. But for now, let's talk about reported consequences versus observable consequences. Sometimes we have things added to situations like additional writing assignments, alternative educational placement, being given alternative tasks different from their peers, being sent to the office or removed from the class, suspensions, loss of privileges, ignoring, physical restraint, call to parents, referral to counselor. So I want to emphasize that of this list, this is just a few examples. I want to emphasize that some of these are reported consequences that you might see that's been added. For example, a student was referred to a counselor. That's a reported consequence that you might see in something like a permanent product. And then there might be observable consequences like a student who's being sent to the office or removed from the class. Emphasis, when you're looking at the ABC recording, you want to look at what's happening immediately after the behavior. Emphasis on the word consequence, not punishment. A lot of times people automatically think that what happens after the behavior, the consequence, is a punishment, when truly it's not, and you should know it's not if the behavior keeps occurring again, because technically punishment is decreasing a problem behavior. So just keep this in the back of your mind when we get into the ABC recording talk. So a toolbox for step 2 with the functional behavior assessment process is that you're, animate a little tool there, you're going to have the following tools that I'm going to discuss in more detail in the next lecture. We're going to talk about direct observations. We're going to talk about that ABC recording, scatter plots, Scadler's functional behavior assessment recording form, and a student, I should say scatter plot, and a student-directed functional assessment interview. Questions that you want to answer. What is the strength of the challenging behavior? For example, what's the frequency, duration, strength, etc.? How does the person's challenging behavior compare to his or her peers? It's really important that we observe what's going on around us and not just focus on just the individual who has the problem behavior. I talked a little bit about that when we talked about social significant behavior. But again, it's really easy to target Johnny, who we might have heard has had a bad day lately, when the reality is all the other students might also be having a problem behavior. And then lastly, we want to know, how does the person's challenging behavior vary across settings? Do they exhibit this problem behavior in all settings, in some settings? That's, again, going back to when is it most and least likely to occur. So we're going to finish this chapter by talking about targeting the behaviors, not the student, talking about the observational pieces that go along with finding out the function of a person's problem behavior. I want to end this lecture before I get into the actual direct observation techniques we're going to talk about by talking about one of my favorite things to do is talk about what a rocking chair really does. It gives us something to do, but it doesn't get us anywhere. So we want to keep in mind that when we're taking our data, we want to make sure that it's not just something we're doing, but it's actually getting us to where we need to go. We want to make sure that when we're collecting data, it's going to give us the information we want to obtain. I have, believe it or not, been in classrooms where I have received stacks, literally binders this big, full of data that told me nothing. There is such a thing as too much data or non-meaningful data. So make a point to ask yourself before you take data, what is the behavior challenge? What do I need to know? And what's the best way to get that baseline data so I can truly figure out the function of the problem behavior? Let's not give ourselves more work than we really need so we can make sure it's really effective in the long run.